Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. There are a lot of things that drive me crazy since October 7. But if there's one thing these days, it is the ease with which people around the world accept Hamas lies and fabrications. It is as if Hamas can say something and it becomes the divine truth, even though it was said by a rapist, murderous, terrorist organization. Israel will say something. Of course, we all know what happens. No one believes it. Here's another problem. People know very little. They know little about this war, about the history of Israel, the history of the conflict with Hamas, what really happened on October 7, who started this ongoing war, and what is the real legal status of the Gaza Strip. Answers are needed, and thankfully Gil Troy, my JPPI colleague, decided to try to give them. He recently published with JPPI the Essential Guide to October 7 and its Aftermath. That's the name. It's available on the Institute's website, and it comes to explain, refute, educate, and simply guide you through what is happening. Knowledge is key, and knowing more means being able to hold your own in a conversation and also to identify when what you're watching on the news just isn't right. I recommend reading the guide, giving it out, sharing with your friends, your coworkers, and your families. But first, listen to this conversation with Gil. He'll explain some more. Here we go. Gil Troy, great to have you back on the JPPI podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you.
So we're here to talk about not U.S.-Israel relations, not Joe Biden, Bibi, speeches before Congress, meetings in the Oval Office, all that mundane, boring stuff.
Conventions.
Elections here, elections there, who knows? We're here to talk about a new publication that came out that you had put together, put up by the Jewish People Policy Institute, JPPI, where we are both senior fellows, called The Essential Guide to October 7th and Its Aftermath, coming up with a lot of figures, facts, history. And it was basically put together, you were explaining to me, because of a feeling that you felt that there is a need out there in particularly the Jewish world for answers to these very difficult questions that people have about what's happened here since October 7th. So explain to us, what is this book about and why did you write it?
So since October 7th, I wake up every day, as you do, saying, how can I help? And so many people around us saying, how can we help? And it's in Israel and throughout the world. People want to respond. And one of the things I keep on thinking about, and this has been a central theme in our podcasts, has been, how do we explain what's going on in Israel to the rest of the world? And there were two particular triggers. One was in early November, I think it was, my friend David Suissa from the Jewish Journal in Los Angeles said that one of his friends asked him, could you get somebody to sort of write about some of the big lies against Israel? And he gave me a deadline, I think it was a Wednesday, and he gave me a deadline of Friday. And I worked like a madman for 36 hours, and I came up with the 9 foundational lies against Israel. Then about 2 months later, I'm sitting with a friend, a colleague of ours, Rachel Fish, in the Aroma Cafe in Jerusalem. And she's saying how many of her friends in Boston, mid-40s, early 50s, with 1, 2, 3 kids, are having trouble explaining what's going on to themselves, to their peers, and to their kids. And so I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if we could get not a 350-page book, which is important too, but out there quickly, a 60-page guidebook that would kind of explain the core issues, that would be easily accessible, that would be colorful, that would have charts and timelines, and help the intelligent Jew and the intelligent non-Jew who just sort of wants to understand some of these very complicated questions. And I'm old-fashioned. I believe in the written word. And I believe that if there are stacks of a 60-page user-friendly guidebook in a synagogue, in a Jewish community center, in a library, people might just sort of take it and read it. And it's not a whole big commitment. And the other thing is I wanted to do it in a way that invited conversation. So I did it around questions, but not propaganda style of question, this is the answer, question, this is the answer. But these are the questions we're struggling with. Like, what happened? Why did Hamas attack? And so the idea is to make it more conversational and invite people to have conversations about this, but based in facts, not just based on theories and opinions.
And I like the way it's kind of built, at least, definitely in the beginning, where it's, here are the 5 big questions, right? I mean, and it's questions that I guess living here, you kind of take for granted knowing the answer. Like, why did Iran attack us? Well, because they hate us, right? And they want to kill us. Like, what happened on October 7th? I think that every Israeli today can, rattle off numbers and what exactly went down. But it seems that for a large part of the world, and even in the Jewish community in the US and North America, they don't have immediately the answer to these questions. And it's not necessarily an issue of hasbara, more like with a public diplomacy angle to it and, go fight for Israel, but more of get educated, right? Understand what's going on.
You're a journalist, but at the end of the day, you're an educator. I'm a historian and I'm a professional educator. We know at the end of the day, what happens is two things. One is that lots of noise, lots of static comes in and clouds people's minds. And one of the interesting statistics I have in the essential guide is simply looking at the way this story has been covered. In the first 6 months after October 7th, the New York Times ran over 4,000 articles, mostly negative, about Israel. In the 9 months that the United States of America led a coalition of allies to fight against the ISIL, the Islamic forces in Mosul, and killed 10,000 civilians who were actually quite friendly to the United States and wanted to be saved, but because urban warfare is so ugly, in those 9 months, the New York Times ran 80 articles. So we're talking about 4,100 articles in 6 months versus 80 articles in 9 months. What does that do to your
Which, by
head?
the way, is a war. Mosul, there was a war they were involved in.
Involved
Gaza,
in, right?
a war they're not fighting in.
1,000 miles away. So this is, so you start looking at statistics like that and you realize the degree to which American Jews, Americans, even though 80% of them are still with us, have been bombarded with all this information that's misinformation or all this distraction. And one of the other things I try to do is, and again, part of it was in writing, but part of it also was a chart. So people say, this is the bloodiest conflict of the 21st century. Now, it's a heartbreaking argument to make, right? But 35,000 Palestinians have been killed according to the Hamas propaganda ministry. That is, unfortunately, a rounding error when we talk about the millions of people killed in the Congo war, which nobody even acknowledges. The 600,000 people killed in Syria, the 377,000 killed in Yemen. And why would Oxfam and the New York Times and others say this is the bloodiest conflict? There's a weird distortion. And so I don't need everybody to agree with me. I don't need everybody to agree with the 60-page booklet here, but I want them to at least look at the facts and say, how can I put this in context? How can I explain this? Now you can't use the word context because the 3 university presidents ruined the term, but I'm a historian. I always say my favorite text is context.
And with that said, though, what I'm getting at is that, I'm looking through this and there's some very, again, basic facts, like the timeline of the Jewish people starts back with Abraham and Sarah, goes up to modern day. It's almost as if you're saying, guys, here, you don't even know this stuff, right? In other words, you when you put this guide together, Gil, it seemed that your working assumption was that there's a lot of people out there who really know very little, right? And that is, I mean, I've long felt that, so you don't have to convince me that the biggest problem, like people, whenever I give a lecture or a talk or people, they always want to know, what should we do? Right. And I'm like, you're expecting me to tell you where to give your money. You're expecting me to tell you make aliyah. You're expecting me to tell you to go vote this way or that way. No, I'll tell you something very simple. Educate yourselves. Know what's really going on. And I think that you're basically saying, just looking at this guide is that most people don't even know anything.
Look, this has been workshopped because even before I was thinking about the guide, I was doing Zooms. I was hosting delegations here of Jews and non-Jews. And I started preparing fact sheets. Now, I'm a boring historian, so I make very, long black and white lists or use texts. And one of my ideas was if I partner with this amazing global think tank of the Jewish People Policy Institute, maybe they can help bring it alive. And we had a remarkable designer, Maya Haas, who put together a beautiful booklet so that it's my words with lots of people like you reading it, adding feedback. I made sure to get people from the left and from the right to read and check, but also we wanted to make it visually interesting. So we would indeed invite people on an educational journey. and invite people to have conversations, I keep on saying, based on facts. So yeah, there's a fact box on what is Zionism. Zionism isn't just the favorite target of too many people on the campus today. Zionism is a legitimate movement of Jewish national liberation, rooted in our story, rooted in our values. And yes, part of the reason why it was important for me to end with a timeline is because people don't just like to attack Israel, and they do this with the United States too. They love to kind of rob us of our story, rob us of our legitimacy. I call this historicide. They're literally trying to kill our history. You want to say you don't like Bibi, fine. You want to say you don't like the occupation, fine. You want to say you don't even like what Israel's doing in Gaza, fine. But why claim that we have no right to this land when we're the original Aboriginal people? We put the in and indigenous. And when you see a timeline going back 4,000 years, you go, wow. When you see a timeline telling the story of Gaza, and you realize that despite all the yelling about occupation and blockade, since 2005, the Palestinians were running that area. And since 2007, after a violent coup, Hamas was running that area. And they could have turned it into the Palestinian Riviera. It's on the Mediterranean. It's got a beautiful coast. But they chose to invest in bombs and bullets and tunnels and propaganda and hatred. So once you start seeing that, you want to criticize Israel, fine, but do it in a way that comes from facts and from understanding the context. And then we can have a serious, intelligent conversation as opposed to just sort of throwing phrases and slogans at one another.
You know, it's amazing, I think, just how little people really do know. And by the way, I mean, also here in Israel to some extent, you know, the Gaza Strip disengagement seems like a lifetime ago to some people. My own kids were shocked a couple months ago. We were sitting and I was telling, I think it was a Shabbat meal, and I was telling people about what I, you know, remember my recollections from being in Gaza during the disengagement, covering it as a reporter or sleeping on the floor of abandoned and evacuated homes. My kids were like, "1 second, you were there?
Yeah,
Wow!" You know, like as
the
if this
Middle
is
Ages.
like ancient history. You know, but it's a huge piece of the story here that people tend to completely ignore and forget, that Israel had been in Gaza, handed it over, pulled back to the last inch. And by the way, there's another thing that a lot of people forget is that back in 2005, before the disengagement from Gaza, there were two very big arguments about Gaza and what exactly to pull out of. One of them was what we're talking about right now, once again, the Philadelphia corridor. There was a huge push by a lot of people that Israel should remain on that strip of land between Gaza and Egypt and keep the IDF there to prevent smuggling. And the second part was the northern part of Gaza, which is just up against like Netiv Sarah, which we know has been bombarded and was infiltrated on October 7th. You used to have three communities, settlements along there in the northern strip, but Ariel Sharon, to pull back to the final inch, decided to pull everyone out. Did we get any credit for it though, Gil? Nothing.
You got about 5 minutes worth of credit. And then immediately they said occupation, right? And they used the word occupation also in such a clever way because, first of all, if we withdrew and we were occupiers, then when do we stop being occupiers? Secondly, too many extremist Palestinians use the word occupation to mean from the river to the sea. Every inch of Israel is occupied. And then other people say, oh, well, I hate the occupation of Israel and the West Bank of Judea and Samaria, and they confuse the two. There's a conflation. So once you've hopefully downloaded this and printed this out, and this is kind of a unique, it's not a typical book. You can download it on Amazon by demand, but we're actually encouraging people. We're sending out the PDF file and encouraging people just to print it out.
And it's available on the JPPI website.
It's available on the JPPI website. Maybe on we'll have a little link on the chat here. And I'm hoping people will print it out with kind of a nice glossy cover and give it the respectability it deserves. I look at this as a kind of a joint publishing venture with the Jewish people. And by the way, we only sent it out a few days ago, and we already have one federation in a major city publishing 10,000 copies. Rabbis getting prepared for the high holidays. One wants 900 copies, one wants 600 copies, because they understand that people are starving for this. And they don't want, I saw some other models where people said, you know, question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. I was reading through about like page 10. I thought I was taking the SATs again. And it felt a little propagandy. I wanted this to be more of a story. And so I wanted to work with the JPPI and get the kind of collective wisdom and genius of people like you who can explain to me some of the military issues. But I also wanted to be in one person's voice, because at the end of the day, as an educator, as a journalist, as an author, you know that you have to tell the story in a certain way. And so that was part of making it both somewhat objective and not heavy-handed, but also trying to make it in a more personal voice.
What has surprised when you were working on this text in the guide? What surprised you as collecting kind of issues and questions of where you felt like, wow, like even this I have to explain, or these myths. I mean, you have, for example, some of like the greatest lies that are said about Israel, or the lot, the slogans that are thrown out there, the colonialism, the occupiers, free Palestine from the river to the sea, all of these different lines that are also out there. But I'm curious, like what, and then how to respond to them and what they really mean. But what surprised you in the work on this?
First of all, I have to say, because one of the questions is what happened on October 7th, simply going back and writing and then reading again and again what happened was just emotionally devastating, right? Even Israelis who are still in some ways in it forget. And we actually write a paragraph or two or three or four about just the viciousness, the evil, the glee that Hamas took in imposing such pain on so many people. I can't tell you how often I got upset. But then also I got tremendously inspired because part of the story also is what I call October 7.2, that within minutes, so many people, including many of our friends and relatives and JPPI colleagues, were already scrambling and saving Israel. And so it's kind of, I kept on going through that roller coaster. That was one thing. The second thing is, yeah, when you actually do in numbers, and it's funny, you do things quickly. So you make a list and you go, oh, let's put genocide in context. So you write the worst genocides. And you go, oh no, because that implies that we're committing genocide. And then when you actually see what is really genocide, genocide is the systematic attempt to destroy a nation. And that was done in Rwanda, killing 800,000 people. It was done with the Armenians, killing 1.2 million people. It was done with the Jews, killing 6 million people. What's going on in Gaza just is a different category. So even in the way you frame it, you have to be very careful. So instead of saying the worst genocides, which implied that this is a genocide, it's just not that bad, right? You see the linguistic game. In the chart today, it's what genocide really looks like, what genocide really is. And again, criticize Israel, but just start with the facts and the distortions, the colonialism, the apartheid, this whole language. And the hope is that this booklet will encourage people, of course, to learn more, but also not just to argue from emotion, but argue from some understanding of facts.
You write a lot about Zionism. You are a self-described Zionist. You wear
Guilty.
that. Yes. And
Proudly guilty as charged.
You're a fellow in Zionist thought at JPPI, but like almost every book of yours has Zionist somewhere in the title. And one of the deceitful phrases or the lies that you point out here is that Zionism is a settler colonialism, is a form of settler colonialism. I'm just curious, as somebody who really has gone deep into Zionism, on the one hand, it's an amazing movement, right? To achieve a Jewish homeland, sovereignty, independence, and it has succeeded, and it's remarkable. We have a president of the United States who describes himself as a Zionist and says, "I can be a Zionist, and I don't even have to be Jewish to be one." So it's some people wear it as a badge of honor, but it's also been used to demonize and to attack the Jewish state of Israel, as well as people around the world. We're all familiar with how anti-Zionism is this form now of anti-Semitism. But where did it maybe go wrong? Or did it never go wrong? It's just been picked on. Or did maybe something go wrong in the definition and the use of it, and how because when I look at these things, I tend to say to myself, it's not as if we're to blame. That's not my point. But maybe there was something that did go off route in the way that it should have been described by Israel, or owned more by the Jewish people.
The great liberal Democrat Daniel Patrick Moynihan, when he served in the United Nations in 1975 and defended Israel and the United States and Western decency against the lie that Zionism is racism, said, "I'm far less interested in the accused. Let's look at the accuser." And we sometimes say, what did we do wrong? And so let's divide it into two. One, fundamentally, the hatred that is against Israel and Zionism is a flow through of the deep, irrational hatred against the Jewish people. And frankly, against America and against the West. There's also a dimension there. But let's just focus for a second on October 7th. And it's so interesting how many secular Israeli Jews, how many distanced American Jews, British Jews, Canadian Jews, how many observers who were not Jewish understood that this attack wasn't just anti-Israeli and anti-Zionist, but it was, in a phrase that became popular, the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. The glee, the zeal, the sadism showed that this is a deep, deep, deep hatred. Now, having said that, I don't want to sidestep the essence of your question, which is, of course, Zionism has made certain mistakes over the years. And of course, Zionism has gotten involved in things that somehow made the case against Israel easier sometimes to make. But we have to distinguish between this irrational hatred, and you see it on October 7th. Had students at McGill, where I taught for so many years, and I continue to have a tie there. Had students at Harvard, where I studied and where you studied so many years ago. Had students at Rutgers on October 7th stopped for a second and said, wow, this is really ugly. I want to sit with my Jewish friends. I want to sit with my Israeli friends. I want to sit with my fellow Americans and say, this is disgusting. And then on October 8th, 9th, 12th, 25th, when Israel finally went into Gaza, said, oh, I don't like what Israel's doing. Then you could say, okay, this is an argument about what Israel does. But the zeal and the speed with which they attacked Israel showed that, nah, this isn't what Israel does, this is what Israel is. And part of the thing I'm trying to do in this guidebook is make people help distinguish between what Israel does and the hatred against what Israel is. Having said that, in a longer conversation, of course, we could point out that obviously the biggest issue has been the inability of the Zionist movement to get out of this difficult box with the Palestinians. Now, fundamentally, as a historian, not just as a Zionist, I blame the Palestinians far more than I blame Israelis or Zionists. But I do think that we've sometimes been so excited about taking all our creativity to make startup nation, all our creativity to advance in high tech and advance in pharma, that we forgot that we also need a lot more creativity in diplomacy, in statesmanship, in leadership. And so that's definitely something that's a piece of it, but it doesn't really account for the insanity and the irrationality and the intensity of the hatred against Israel or Zionism.
But then you have people who will tell you, what do you mean? I mean, I tend to look at this and say, something happens to people when they think of Israel, when they talk about Israel. It's like the brains go out the window. I just see it too often. And whether it's in interviews that I'll be giving where I'm asked crazy questions, or I hear comments from like a BBC anchor recently that Hezbollah is only attacking Israel because it's concerned for the lives of Palestinians. But other comments
And
like
you
that,
defended the position quite eloquently, I have to say.
thank you. But there's something that happens to these people that when it comes to Israel, it comes to the Zionist state of Israel, that they can't think rationally anymore. But they'll tell you, no, but I'm not an anti-Semite. I just am critical of Israel. How do you make that distinction between what is legitimate and what is not legitimate?
Look at the JPPI, in the Jerusalem Post, in your columns, just your column this week. We all know how to criticize Israel, but there's a difference between criticizing Israel and demonizing Israel and delegitimizing Israel. And there's a difference between kind of healthy, fair criticism and, turning Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis into some kind of Palestine liberation movement when they've actually done more to harm Palestinians and they've sacrificed more Palestinian lives than anybody else. So let's put the Israel and Jewish thing aside. There's also a certain irrational kind of anti-Americanism too. And part of, I think, the link with anti-Americanism and anti-Zionism is that both the United States of America and Israel are aspirational democracies. They're not just democracies that are liberal democracies that want to give everybody what Canadians offer, which is peace, order, and good government. But they have very high ideals to be a free people on our homeland, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The very high ideals that both the United States and Israel articulate, and certainly the entire Jewish civilization articulates, often leads critics to be extra harsh. You see, you don't come close to your aspirations. And one of the things I keep on saying, one of the things I'm trying to do in the booklet is, I don't judge Israel by Syria. I don't judge Israel by Hamas. I judge Israel by its exclusive club of democracies. How does the United States behave? How does Britain behave? Why do you have a West Point major, John Spencer, who keeps on saying, I can't believe how disciplined Israel has been in warfare. I know that the United Nations has a kill ratio of 10 civilians for every combatant in urban warfare for democracies. And Israel, even if you accept Hamas's figures, has been more or less at 1-to-1. That's remarkable.
Yeah.
How could it be that Israel has killed 17,000 Hamas terrorists? At least, I think they're probably more, and has been able to defend itself so effectively that, and I hate to use this word, only 360 Israeli soldiers have fallen, when all the expectations, the West Point expectations, the UN expectations, the Israeli expectations were that thousands of Israeli soldiers would be killed. Does that mean that we don't respect Palestinian life? No, it actually shows we value human life. The fact that we value human life means that we then end up in the crosshairs. It's insane. So again, no, it's foolish to try to say Israel's perfect, but our enemies are perfectly awful. And hopefully this guidebook will help people just balance the conversation and then have robust debates, but start with some facts, start with some history, start with some figures.
So you end the book in the epilogue with the lessons of April 13th. And to our viewers and listeners, April 13th was when Iran launched an unprecedented barrage of 300 plus drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles at Israel. 99% of them intercepted by a collective of countries, including Israel, of course, the US, the French, the British. Jordan was involved. The Saudis were involved to some extent. Really remarkable coalition that had been put together. And you end with, and I'll just read, such international synergy suggests that we will win this civilizational battle, and with vision, grit, and moral clarity, emerge from these dark days with the global forces of enlightenment strengthened, and now including more and more Arab brothers and sisters. Now, I love the positivity, but there is a flip side to that as well, which is that unfortunately, it also, one of the lessons is, and you do kind of point this out, the multi-front war, and you do write about this as well, is that I think that one of the lessons, and you do say this, is that one of the lessons of this April 13th incident is that this is October 7th, not the end, right? Unfortunately, these are battles that we are going to have to see time over and again. And I think that that's also why this guide, personally, I think that's why this guide is so important, because get educated now, because the next war, sadly, unfortunately, I hope it doesn't come, but I think we have to be realistic and recognize it's just a matter of time.
We have to distinguish between wars that are based on border disputes and over resources. And ultimately, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has that dimension, right? Because Palestinians say, from the river to the sea, we want this piece of land. That's one kind of conflict. But then there's also a kind of whole jihadist conflict. The Houthis, Hezbollah, Iran, what are they doing fighting us? And that is a kind of insane hatred that goes way beyond fighting over borders and fighting over resources, which on the one hand should be easier to solve, because what do they really want from us? But it's actually harder, because the one resource they want from us is the oxygen that we use to breathe. They want to destroy us. And one of the biggest mistakes before October 6th was that no one, not the United States of America and its experts, not enough people in our own government, took Hamas seriously. I have a problem. I read their charter. In translation, admittedly, I have a problem. I read what the Iranian mullahs say. In translation, I see that they call us little Satan. The United States of America is big Satan. We have to take their words seriously. It's condescending. It's actually anti-Arabic. It's Islamophobic to dismiss them and say, oh, they're just words. I take their words seriously. So yes, we have a lot of work ahead. This is conceived as the first of a series of guidebooks. And one of the debates I'm having is whether the next one I should already be working on is the essential guide to the Hezbollah, Houthi, and Iranian war, or should it be the essential guide to Zionism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Zionism? Should it be the essential guide to Jewish parenting at this moment, to being a Jewish student at this moment? I think there are many 60-page colorful booklets that we can churn out, because there are indeed many issues. But two things. One is it's really important that we continue the conversation substantively. And two, with all the challenges, I am indeed a Zionist, and Golda Meir said you can't be a Zionist and a pessimist. So I won't stop hoping. I won't stop hoping that out of that insanity of April 13th, we also learned a lot of lessons about international cooperation, that despite the Israel apartheid charge, we see that this is not a racial conflict and that we do want to cooperate. We're jonesing to work closely with the rest of the Arab world if they're willing to accept us. Israel isn't anti-Arab. Israel is just against those people who want to destroy us. And who isn't? And finally, I hope we also realize that this is a civilizational conflict. And I call this a joint publishing venture with the Jewish people and the Jewish world, but I want us also to spread this out to the non-Jewish world, because this is a fight for American values. This is a fight for British, Canadian, Australian, French values. I hope it's translated into French, into Spanish, maybe even into Hebrew, because I think, as you said earlier, Israelis need this too. And I hope we just continue the conversation with respect, with substance, and with vision, and yes, with hatikva, hope.
Well, Gil, thank you very much for being with us. And again, to everyone, this is the essential guide to October 7th and its aftermath. You can download it at the JPPI, the Jewish People Policy Institute's website, jppi.org.il, or just Google Essential Guide to October 7th, Gil Troy, and you will find it there. Really an important read. And as much as we think we know, there is a lot that we still do not know about what happened, and people should really, most important thing that we can do is read, educate, and know more, because knowledge is, I hate to use the cliche, but knowledge really is power in when it comes to fighting these lies and the slogans that are out to demonize us. So thank you very much, Gil, for joining us. And to all our viewers and listeners, this was another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. You can find us every Monday and Thursday, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. In the meantime, have a great rest of your week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.